TFM.
This is J.G. Hertzler, General Martok on Deep Space Nine, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Welcome, Niners, to another episode of The Orb, our dedicated Deep Space Nine show. I'm Christopher Jones, and with me, as he always is my esteemed co-host, Matthew Rushing. And Matthew, I hate to disturb those awesome exercises that you're doing right there. Looks like you've been training with Bashir.
Yes. So if I sound a little bit out of breath, I'm sorry, but he runs a very rigid program to get ready for the games, and I'm sorry. I'm just I was a little distracted there. This suit is just it's a little bit tight in some areas.
A little bit tight. Oh goodness, 90s Trek and the tight suits.
Which apparently I'm going to say. I was reading the wonderful behind-the-scenes book there by Terry Erdman, and apparently Robert Hewitt Wolf said they got many, many, many letters that said how much they enjoyed Bashir's tight suit. So, which is creepy in and of itself.
That's interesting. So today, everyone, we're going to talk about Rivals, as you can tell from our little chatter here, but not the episode itself so much as a review. We were going to talk about Martus, the character of Martus, because El-Aurians are back in the spotlight thanks to Star Trek Picard and Guinan and young Guinan. And in thinking about that, we were remembering that the first time that a character is ever actually referred to as being an El-Aurian is in the DS9 episode Rivals with Martus. Because we haven't yet gotten to Generations. Generations comes about 11 months after this episode aired. So it'll be a while before we learn that Guinan is an El-Aurian. We learn about Soran as well, and we'll talk about them a little bit. And Matthew, to kick this off, the interesting little factoid about Martus in this episode is that originally he was conceived as being Guinan's wayward son.
Yeah, this is something that I was really fascinated by because it's been a long time since I've been through the behind-the-scenes companion and, read through. And I was just thinking to myself about what that would have added to this episode. I think Deep Space Nine is so good about connecting to so many things, especially many things that we get on TNG. And this episode itself, Rivals, is good, but it's mostly known, and I think it's best when it's all about Bashir and O'Brien. And the actual
You don't mean the whole
Rivals
series, you mean this story, I think, right?
Yeah.
The entire series is about Miles and Jules.
Yeah, no, this episode specifically, obviously, is what I'm referring to. But I think it suffers a little bit because that side of the story feels kind of shallow. Mm-hmm. And I think it would have been really fascinating to have this character be related to Guinan, be a wayward son, and, be somebody that kind of has struggled to maybe, live up to his mother and, her expectations, but even just her reputation as well. I think that would have made it much more fascinating and have much more depth on that side of the story. And so it's disappointing they didn't go that direction because Whoopi Goldberg was not available for a cameo. But it does seem like you don't necessarily have to have her in the story for that to still be there.
Yeah, I think they could have done something more with it without her being there. I think the original, and some of this is documented and some of it is maybe not. And I'm just thinking about the writers coming up with this idea and the timing of it. I imagine that connecting to TNG by having Guinan on DS9 would have been the primary reason for the entire idea of Guinan having this son who wanders onto the station. And so once she wasn't available and they changed the character so that he's no longer referenced as being Guinan's son, I think that's where we lost a lot of the potential for the episode. But they kept him as an El-Aurian, and even though they hadn't named Guinan as an El-Aurian on The Next Generation, we knew that she was a listener. And here, they're presenting Martus as, oh, he's an El-Aurian, a species of listeners. Odo gives us that line. When we watch it in retrospect now, we can connect all the dots and we can have the conversation that we're going to have today. But at the time that it aired, because we didn't know that that was Guinan's species yet, and then here's this guy who's an El-Aurian and he's a listener, maybe we can make that connection because we knew that Guinan's species was a species of listeners. But I think that moving forward with the story, after a key hook to the story was pulled away, makes that aspect of the story a little bit harder to pull off.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. And, I think what it does is it would have just given you the ability to really explore the character in some more depth. It would have had you care about the character more. Because at the same time, when you think about it, it would have also, I think, really helped with the coming generations, because we are building on something that then they're going to build on in that film, right? And so fans would have been able to make, those connecting dots too. And I think it would have been interesting just to add to the character of Guinan. Obviously she's been around for so long, and the fact that it makes sense that she would have been in some relationships throughout time, having a child and everything, and having them not necessarily turn out the way they would want would have been really interesting. Another thing too, Chris, that I'm just thinking of when it comes to El-Aurians, we see them and the idea that they are listeners, and there's some type of empathic ability that they have as well. And obviously all the time we've spent with Guinan, we see her using those powers for good. But I think one of the most interesting things about this episode too is that this is the first time we see one of those characters taking that power and using it for evil or for own personal gain.
For own personal gain, yeah.
Right. But I mean, even just thinking through the episode, Martus is not a good person at all.
Right.
He's not just shady, and he's not just doing things for personal gain, but he has no cares about who he hurts and how he hurts them, really, as long as it helps his bottom line. To me, that's just really fascinating, the idea of you would take this gift that you have and you would turn it from a gift to a curse for other people.
Yeah. Well, what you say there is interesting, because the title Rivals, I tend to think of it as being mostly about Bashir and O'Brien, because, like you, I love that friendship and that story, but it also refers to Quark and Martus. And as you just said, Martus, he's very shady. He's in this for personal gain. He doesn't care who he hurts. And you tend to think of Quark as being that way, and maybe he was a bit like that when the Cardassians were on the station. But even at this point in the series, in the second season, Quark is already changing. And I think Quark, he doesn't mind ripping people off, but I wouldn't necessarily say that he doesn't care about some people, and he doesn't care if he hurts some people. So you've already got a nice contrast here with Quark. and Martus and their interactions.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think the interesting thing here is that by not connecting with Guinan again, we also don't kind of set up, at least for fans that are watching, the idea that not all El-Aurians are good.
Mm-hmm.
So when we run into Tolian Soran in Generations, and, he's somebody who cannot deal with his inability to get back into the Nexus and uses his powers, obviously, for evil. I mean, he's willing to destroy entire worlds. He's willing to create wars between groups if needed. He's willing to use people in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I think that's fascinating because him and Martus really are very similar people. Martus is less genocidal, but the way that they use their gift to try and get what they want is honestly kind of chilling. And so what it really shows is that, like, and it would have been interesting if Star Trek had ever pushed toward the idea of leftover El-Aurians, some of them being quite evil and being a powerhouse that the Federation ends up having to deal with as an enemy.
Mm-hmm. But it would be very difficult to negotiate with them because they would just be sitting on the other side of the table listening to you.
It's true. You would just nodding their heads. Mm-hmm,
and you would have to do all the talking.
How does that make you feel?
Yeah. It is interesting that of the three named El-Aurians who we see in Star Trek, two of them are very selfish and cause a lot of harm to other people. And then one of them is perhaps the greatest counselor in the franchise. I think that maybe part of it is that Guinan was set up to be this character who's the bartender, who is the counselor to the captain and the crew and listens to people. And you have this backstory of how her species is one of listeners. And then later you need to give a name to that species, and then you start to show more of them, and you apply that quality of being a listener to these new characters. You don't want to duplicate the Guinan character. And also, the others that we've seen have been one-offs. One episode of Deep Space Nine, one film. And applying that trait to them without having the context of being in a series and being this barkeeper like this is probably one reason why we get this other flavor. Because what we're really getting are standard characters. In the case of Soran, a villain. I don't think I would call Martus a villain. He's just a con artist, as Quark would say. And they're those standard characters who are having this El-Aurian trait grafted onto them.
Yeah, I think that's interesting too, because it almost does kind of seem like a throwaway. Again, once you take away the connection with Guinan, it lacks that kind of unique quality to it, and something I think that would have really made this work better, especially in the episode, and especially for Martus, where anybody can be a good listener.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody can develop that skill and utilize that skill well. You don't necessarily have to be an El-Aurian to do that. And so it as you kind of said back at the beginning, once you take away one of the big cornerstones of your script, it does leave it feeling like the Leaning Tower of casinos. It's just like you don't get the full weight of the story that they were going for. And I think that's one of the reasons too, when you look at Rivals as well. And it's one of those things where, even Armin Shimmerman just felt like the story was lacking something. And I think it just is, because it doesn't really necessarily mean as much as it could have. And it's disappointing that they just didn't try to work a way around that idea and didn't try a little harder for that idea.
Yeah. Yeah, at times the story does feel like a story in search of I don't want to say plot. It has a plot. It has a couple of plots, but it feels like the pieces have been stuck together. They're trying to make the story work. And there is, something missing that would make it feel cohesive. I enjoy the story. It's a fine episode for me. I watch it from time to time. I do tend to watch it more for the Miles and Julian parts, though. And also, I love racquetball, and I think the space racquetball that they've got going is really cool as well.
Well, and I do. This is one of those things, and obviously, we talked a little bit about the idea that one of the things that's interesting is to see, Guinan back in Star Trek Picard now, and her role in that episode. She has the role at the beginning there, and then with episode 4, and the fact that she's been on Earth a long time, and she's she's involved with the supervisors, which is interesting as well. So, and they putting those talents to use, the idea of listeners. And so it is something to where I'm actually kind of sad that they never use El-Aurians more. It feels as though, especially after Generations, where we see what happens to them, the Borg having come and destroyed their home world, and, them being a scattered race now, this diaspora across the Federation. And it would have been very interesting, honestly, to see what it is that they did. And again, we only have really 3 of them to go off of them, and 2 of them are not great. So, and or evil. So,
well, it would have been watching now, as you say, watching Picard. It would be nice if we had more background on the El-Aurians, because it might help us speculate a bit on what's going on. But it would also just, I think, make the story even more rewarding. But there had been talk about having Martus be a recurring character on DS9. And had that happened, maybe they would have been able to build up who the El-Aurians are a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the types of stories that we get in season 2, I would think, he's just going to be this con artist who's on the station who annoys Quark in some episodes along the way. But the way that the series and the writing evolved past season 2, and especially in the later seasons, I could see them doing more with Martus as an El-Aurian, and the DS9 writers building more of that El-Aurian background for us as viewers. Another reason we probably didn't get much after Generations, when that movie really sets up potential for the El-Aurians, is that after Generations, DS9 gets more and more into the Dominion storyline. Voyager is lost in the Delta Quadrant, and Enterprise is a prequel, and they could have had El-Aurians on Enterprise, but it doesn't really fit with the story that they were telling, so I'm not surprised. And then we have all those years of no Star Trek, so the poor El-Aurians, they just left wandering around the galaxy.
Well, and I think, it would have been it would have been really fascinating, because when you think of who they are and their gifts, it does seem like these people would have been very interesting to have as, Federation ambassadors, to be obviously counselors. I mean, but there's lots of different roles that you would have felt like it would have been a good place to kind of insert them as a race of people that, you know, are like, if you want a character where you don't have to worry about doing makeup and everything, you can, you know, put an El-Aurian in there and use them. But yeah, I'm just surprised that, you know, we never see them in those roles. Heck, it would have been even interesting to have them, one of them show up as like a Starfleet admiral that wasn't a badmiral, right? You know, so
yeah.
At that point, you could almost seen like maybe Admiral Ross being an El-Aurian, because, you know, he seems to be actually a pretty good listener, and so it just there's lots of different places where you could have really had that, and it seems like, because they never went anywhere with this being Guinan's son, it was never anything worth following up on in the first place. And so it's just a kind of a thread that gets cut and never gets picked up again to be woven back into the tapestry of Star Trek, which is, you know, it happens. Obviously, Deep Space Nine was very good with just putting threads out there that they could then pick up on later on. But yeah, I mean, this one, they kind of, I think, they kind of shoot themselves in the foot in the sense where, because they don't really create a thread that you would want to pull on here, because the episode itself doesn't become as successful as they want and really gel the way they want. It's just not worth it for them. So
yeah. And of course, that's our view. Again, watching it years and years later after we find out that Guinan is an El-Aurian, and now we're looking for backstory, because when it first aired and you're watching it, it's very easy to just kind of see Martus as a one-off character. You know, he's the guest character of the week on the show, and once the episode's over, you don't think about it anymore, because there's no indication that he's going to come back at that point. I'm glad that he didn't come back, because again, at this point in the show, I can see them creatively thinking it might be interesting to have a foil for Quark on the station, who is also sort of a con artist doing shady things, who runs a club. But the way that the show evolved, if that element had been there and they had felt like they had to revisit that maybe once a season or something like that, I think it would have taken time away from the more important stories that were going on.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I don't think in the end it turned out to be as successful as a character as they wanted in the first place, you know, with everything we've talked about. Because I think we talked about the actual episode of Rivals.
Yeah, we have talked about it before. Yeah.
So, it just, you know, and that's just part of it. But it will be interesting to see if Star Trek chooses to do anything with these characters in the future. Obviously, you've got Strange New Worlds happening. Of course, you've also got Discovery happening, and I don't even remember what century they're in at this point, but it's pretty far in the future.
32nd.
Yeah, and then of course, you know, we have one more season of Picard coming after this, so it'll be interesting to see if they ever pick up those threads at all. So,
well, Star Trek Discovery Season 5, a group of refugee El-Aurians have found a powerful weapon and are going to destroy all life in the galaxy unless Michael Burnham can stop them in 12 episodes. So tune in for that.
That does sound like a season of Discovery. So right. Yeah.
But I did want to...
It amplifies their listening power so they can hear you.
That's exactly
even if they're across the galaxy. That's what it is. That's what it is. So that they start learning all the secrets of the galaxy.
Right.
And,
yeah, there are no secrets in the 32nd century, thanks to the El-Aurians, who have set up shop in orbit of the massive black hole at the center of the galaxy, and now they're listening in every direction.
It's terrible. It's terrible.
Speaking of their listening abilities, I did want to ask you about this. So Guinan, being a listener on the Next Generation, of course, she's a good listener. And as you said earlier, anyone can learn to be a good listener. And I think that's true mostly, although I do think that some people have a natural, like an innate ability to listen and process and express empathy. that you maybe can't learn. Like you could learn to fake the empathy, but I think people who can naturally do that, it's just who they are. That comes across in an authentic way that helps the other person a lot more than someone who's just kind of learned to listen. Because even I will tell people, listen more and talk less, and you'll understand people better and have better relationships and interactions with them. But what I wanted to ask you is that there are times when Guinan is talking to Picard, especially, where I feel like it goes beyond listening, and it's separate from this ability that she has and El-Aurians have, as they've now told us in Picard, to sense when something is wrong with time, that things aren't as they should be. It's not an empathic ability like Troy, I don't think, but there does seem to be something there where they're connected to the person they're talking to in a deeper way than we are when we talk to each other, for example. And with Guinan, I feel that, but with Soran, I felt that in Generations a bit. His interactions with Picard. Yes, Picard's reaction to the line "Time is the fire in which we burn" is due to the fact that Renee had died in the fire, and that sets up the episode. Yes, that's the primary reason. But I also felt that when Soran talked to people, there was this sort of like deeper connection, like he's piercing into your soul somehow. But with Martus, he's talking to the woman who's conning him about the asteroid mining, and he doesn't pick up that he's being conned at all, even though it's pretty obvious to everyone watching the episode, I think, that she's setting him up for something with her sad story and how she can't believe she's sharing this with him. But that went right over his head.
Yeah, I think, what is interesting about him as a character is the fact that, what you see, he uses his abilities for himself, but he's not using his abilities the same way that a lot of other El-Aurians do, which is basically to always be on, to always be, truly trying to figure out what's going on with people.
And to help others.
So, exactly.
Because Guinan is trying to help others.
And I do feel like that you see Soran too. Soran is always on because he's worried about people taking advantage of him and, not being able to get what he wants. And so I just think one of the most interesting things is that Martus is just kind of a tool, who is using other people's tools, and he's just in every way, shape, and form, he's just kind of asking to be taken advantage of. I think that that's really interesting because, again, he truly only cares about himself, and in only caring about himself, he leaves himself open to be victimized, just as he's creating victims.
Yeah, I think he's listening. He's listening for the information that could benefit him, but otherwise he's just hearing. He's not listening. He's talking to people. He may appear as if he's listening, but he's just hearing them talk, listening for specific bits of information that he can use for his own gain. That's, I guess, a good way to describe Martus. All right. Well, any other thoughts about El-Aurians? This is a pretty niche topic for us today, so there's not a huge amount to talk about, but I just thought it would be fun to revisit him in light of Guinan's appearance in Picard, because El-Aurians are all the rage right now.
They absolutely are. No, I think the thing that I am interested in there, though, in Star Trek now, is that by using the character of Guinan once again, will this be something that we will spend some more time on in a race we might see later on in other parts of Star Trek? and utilize? Or are we just going to kind of keep it as, we got Guinan, that's special enough. We don't need to kind of overdo this. And so, and I don't know, maybe that's one of the things that they just kind of realized is that we never really saw many El-Aurians again because there's just not a lot to necessarily do with them, and so it's just not as exciting as they thought it was going to be. Well, as a race.
I think the fact that they look just like humans makes it harder because you have to point out that they are El-Aurians. Otherwise, you don't know. I was just thinking that I'm sure Lower Decks will throw one in somewhere at some point. But again, how do you do it in a situation like that? Because they look like humans, unless they all wear hats like Guinan. That's the only way to do it.
It's all the rage.
I guess
it's all the rage, Chris.
I think maybe from now on, all El-Aurians will have hair like young Guinan on Picard and wear a big purple hat like the Guinan that we've known for so long.
Perfect.
They'll all be
Sounds
like that
perfect.
because we love in Star Trek to make monolithic cultures where everyone has the same clothes and the same hair and everything.
There you go. That's the way to go.
I can imagine Discovery trying to throw one in season 5 somehow, but knowing the designers there, they'll like reimagine the makeup of El-Aurians or something. And I don't know. Anyway, and of course you and I, we love the books and comics and the literature, and we have the show Literary Treks. And so one might think, I'm sure they've explored El-Aurians in the novels, and you guys just aren't talking about it because you're keeping it on screen. No, not really. They've been in, novelizations and comics related to these episodes where Guinan has appeared. But that's pretty much it. The Borg Spotlight comic. So,
yep.
Maybe it's up to us, Matthew. Maybe we need to write the definitive history of El-Aurians with our own fan fiction.
Maybe so. Yeah, I mean,
You're looking at me like, I don't want to spend my valuable time doing that.
No, I was just thinking, if I remember correctly, Guinan's a part of, I think, the Buried Age as well. So we kind of see part of her past with Picard there. So there's some things that like that. But yeah, there's really not a ton out there with them, even in that format, which is interesting.
But the thing about that is that that's a Guinan, not the El-Aurians. So that's where we...
Yeah, so...
Yeah, it all comes back to Guinan. All right, well, this was an interesting chat about El-Aurians. If you have any thoughts on El-Aurians you'd like to share with us, we would love to hear those. You can do that by going to our listeners group on Facebook, the Babel Conference, and find the post for this episode there, and you can comment, talk to us and fellow listeners. If you're not already in the Babel Conference, just go to Facebook and type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field, and it should come right on up. It is a closed group, so please do answer the questions and agree to the rules of the forum so I can let you in. You can also send us email. Go to our website, trek.fm/contact. Use the form you find there and choose to send to a show and choose the orb, and that'll come to Matthew and me by email. And of course, you can find us everywhere on social media. Our username is TrekFM on Twitter, Instagram, all over the place, and we would love to chat with you there also. Now, Matthew, when you're not busy setting up all the candles you can find in your room right there to get ready for your next podcast, where can people find you?
Well, when I'm not doing that, which takes quite a long time, you can find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02. Of course, here on the network, I am on our whole other side of the network called the 602 Club, where we don't talk about Star Trek, but we talk about all those other fandoms that we love. You can also find me here on the network doing Literary Treks, Warp 5, and The Artificial Tango. Literary Treks about the books and the comics of Star Trek. Warp 5, Chris, you and I have been walking through every single episode of Enterprise. We finished season 1, and we'll be back to season 2 soon. And then Artificial Tango, we are having a really good time doing, well, a little bit of tango as we talk about Star Trek Picard Season 2. And then, of course, you can find me over on the Nerd Party Network. I've got 2 shows there. One is completed, called Outpost. Did that with Drea Kaufman. And we talked about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. And then I'm over there doing aggressive negotiations with John Mills as we talk about Star Wars each and every week. But Chris, when you're not trying to figure out how not to pull a hammy with the racquetball, where can people find you?
Hey, Bashir, he might be a little younger than me, but I can still take him in a game of space racquetball. I'll be all right. When I'm not practicing for that, however, you can find me elsewhere on the network, as you mentioned, talking Enterprise with you on Warp 5. Sometimes drop in on Literary Trek. It's been a while for that, so I'd like to get back in there at some point and do a book with you. And I also have Interface, and Larry Demachek and I do the Ready Room from time to time. And, like you said, talking some Guinan on the Artificial Tango. Looking forward to the rest of Picard Season 2. And if you'd like to share your thoughts on any of that stuff with me or chat about whatever, you can find me on Twitter. My username is CBryanJones, letter C and Bryan with a Y. That is my username everywhere in social media, but Twitter is where I'm most active. And I'd love to chat with you. Now, if you would like to help us keep this show and everything else we're doing here on the network going, we could definitely use your help. If you'd like to get involved in the network supporting us, go to patreon.com/trekfm. That's patreon.com/trekfm to find out how. We really send a huge thank you to everyone who's supporting us right now. We would not be here without you, and we hope that if you're not, you'll consider coming aboard. Thank you so much for your support. Well, Matthew, it was fun opening another orb with you, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Well, Chris, we want to thank everybody for joining us, and we will see you next time as we gaze into the orb.
Welcome, boomers, to another episode of... Which show are we doing, Matthew? Let me do this again. Okay. Welcome, Niners, to another episode of The Orb, our dedicated Deep Space Nine show.